two specific learning points that we need to attend to, that through this discussion, we hope that we'll gain an in-depth understanding and appreciation of the dynamics that occur in global governance. You realize across this presentation, this discussion, today's topic unites a few elements in the very first topic we looked into, that is on governance, and brings in the elements of public policy, which we looked at about 2 weeks ago. And now, if you like it, it pushes what we would call public policy formation to the international scene to talk about now not public policy merely, but to talk about regime. To talk about regime. That is regime that governs the international bodies, international states, if you like, nation states, as we'll see. Secondly, by going through this discussion, we hope to gain again an understanding and application of how this international regime theory can be applied at various levels of leadership models. This would be in the NGO world that some of us are involved in, would be in the education sector that many of us are involved in, and the general parameters of leadership. So we hope that these elements should be able to be mirrored across our discussion. Now, to lead us into this discussion, want to begin by looking at, or rather gaining a general understanding of what international regimes are. Generally, when the concept of international regimes is mentioned, one imagines that by regime, we could be talking about, a government, there is that conception of a government. For example, one would talk about so and so's regime. For example, in the Kenyan situation, one would easily imagine then regime would be talking about the mention of perhaps the President William Ruto regime, the President Uhuru Kenyatta regime, and such like things. Far from that understanding, our general understanding of international regimes in this course is centered on the issues that are put forth in this slide. For instance, number one, we look at international regimes as setting of rules and processes that guide actions or patterns of behavior of national states in the international sphere. So we are talking about those elements, those issues in which rules, processes are set, processes that will guide really the behavior, the actions of national states in the international sphere. Now, this particular concept is pegged on the fact that there is an assumption that in the international scene, nations find themselves in an anarchic kind of relationship, anarchy, as it were. We remember here, a philosopher by the name Thomas Hobbes, who would mention that human nature everywhere is an anarchy, is brutish, is short, So you see, the conception of international regimes is supposed to create order. You are setting up rules, you are setting up processes that will create order. It is an understanding that there is no single nation in the world that can set either authority, if you like, legitimate authority over other nation states. So international regimes are understood as those processes, those rules that come to set order in that international scene so that kind of cooperation, working together is fostered. Secondly, Our understanding of international regimes is pegged on a need to create agreements that are signed through multiple states. These multiple states, we talk about countries, nations. This could be, for example, we talk about COMESA, we talk about the East African Community, we talk about the European Union. This is what we're talking about, multiple states. However, sorry for that. However, besides these multiple states, we always have several non-state actors, e.g., non-government organization, UN bodies, and so forth. Sometimes even we have individuals. Now, underlying this understanding, once these multiple states come together to create an agreement, to sign agreements, it ipso facto means that they surrender certain rights. However, they don't annul their sovereignty as states. Still understanding what, really placing our finger on what international regimes are, we appreciate that international regimes offer a platform for free and fair discussions. Okay, this one, as we'll see within the slides, it could be a little bit what you would call more theoretical. However, on the practical scenes, as we move through the slides, we'll question a few things as to whether really some of these international regimes guarantee free and fair discussions, especially for all the nation states involved. However, that notwithstanding, the understanding here is that these regimes are supposed to encourage cooperation between states and try to destroy competition between those nation states. Finally, the conceptual understanding of international regimes is often mirrored in literature by the term institutions. So we'd like to mention that whenever the term institutions are mentioned, this does not necessarily mean an international body. Institutions simply will refer to that set of agreement. That's why we are saying international regimes are conceptually is the word to underline, are conceptually institutions which are non-material phenomena. You see, this means that international regimes are not synonymous with international organizations, which have a kind of a material existence. By these international organizations, we want to talk about things like the African Union. African Union has material existence. It has a personnel staff. It has budget. It has a structure. You can put your finger physically on the African Union. We're talking about the United Nations bodies. You see, these are material entities. However, we are saying international regimes are not only explicit rules like international treaties, but also could include implicit customs. So you notice that when we are talking about international regimes, we are going a little bit far beyond simply an international body to include very invisible agreements, very invisible agreements. You are talking about treaties that are signed that bind, for example, member actors without necessarily having to talk about a material substance body existing somewhere. Now, we look at the history and background of the international regime. These first 3, 4, 5 slides are trying to create the conception of what international regimes are. Now, generally, international regimes, one would agree, play a very pivotal role in international politics and relations. These regimes occasionally they begin as institutions in terms of agreements, but could develop gradually into international organizations. However, as we've underlined in the previous slide, international organizations should not be construed to mean that they are synonymous with international regimes. We put it this way: international organizations are founded on international regimes, but international regimes are greater. Put differently, we can be able to say international organizations are a subset of international regimes. We give examples of how international regimes have begun in the recent past. Two examples here from the West. The first example concerns the Bretton Woods institution regimes. Here we refer to commonly what we refer to as the World Bank and IMF. So let's see, for example, historical background just to understand this. You see, in 1944, the European powers come together, here after the World War II, the Second World War II, they come together, feeling the devastations of the war. They agree to pull together resources, monetary resources, so that they can rebuild the post-war Europe. Now, this coming together slowly develops into the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which essentially was to provide monetary stability and advice to nations. And on the other hand, the World Bank, which was to provide loans for infrastructure and capacity building. So you see, let's focus on that bullet. We are having the post-World War II situation whereby nations are coming together, they are agreeing together, they are being brought together by a common intention to rebuild Europe. Generally, this coming together is now what develops into what we today call IMF and the World Bank. So you see, behind IMF, behind the World Bank, as an organization, a physical organization, there is a regime, an agreement, a regime. We'll be looking at a lot of this in the slides to come. I give another example here of what we call the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, which was founded in 1948 with the aim of encouraging free trade and reduce barriers to free trade environment. Again, this one develops gradually, and by 1994, it develops into what we currently call the World Trade Organization. So you see, what sometimes we call international organizations is what actually materially grows from really an immaterial entity that we are calling international regimes. So what are international regimes then, by definition? Citing Stephen Krasner, who defines international regimes as a set of principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actors come together with their expectations around a given issue so that they can foster their cooperation and international relations. Several thinkers, e.g. Keohane, 1989, Young, 1989 again, have actually built up this conception of international regime. So from Stephen Krasner, we see, and we'll be discussing this in a moment, we see the four main elements, features that constitute international regimes. The first feature of international regimes, we'll be looking at this, is what we call principles. International regimes refer to principles. International regimes refer to norms. They refer to rules. They refer to procedures. through which actors, these actors who are mostly nation states, they put together the expectations, they converge the expectations around these four elements around a given issue. In a few slides to come, we'll be critiquing this definition to be able to look at what some of these elements mean, to be able to appreciate these concepts, and to be able, of course, to critique some of these concepts. So several thinkers, the way I've said, e.g. Kegode, looks at international regimes as institutions and defines them as persistent and connected set of rules, whether these rules be formal, whether they be informal, that prescribe behavior of national states, which shape expectations of how other parties need to behave. Young, in argumenting this Krasner's definition, adds that international regimes refer to identifiable practices of recognized roles linked by cluster to rules or conventions governing relations among occupants of those roles. Now, what is fundamental on the definition of international regimes is the fact that those actors who come together express full consent. This expression of full consent also always involves some surrender of some powers or so. So we'll be looking in a moment at those elements in the definition and be able to look at this. So you see what I've just mentioned, that those are the four components of international regimes. That's the principles, the norms, the rules, and the decision-making procedures. Those four elements make up the components of an international regime. Of course, we are saying here that sometimes when these components come together and are formally organized, they could transform into an intergovernmental organization in the manner in which we talk about, for example, the East African Community, in the manner in which we talk about the European Union, in the manner in which we talk about the World Trade Organization, and such similar other ideas. Now, looking at this definition, two criticisms have been raised against this definition. Remember, the definition that puts international regimes as referring to principles, to norms, to rules, and decision-making procedures that govern the expectations of member states. There are two criticisms that have been raised against this definition. The first criticism concerns the vagueness of the definition. We'll be looking at this. Some people argue that this definition is very vague. The second criticism is the one that argues that when you look at these elements, principles, norms, rules, procedures, it's very difficult to distinguish these components. They look like referring to the same thing. So we are saying, when we look at the first, when we look at the first set of criticism that is based on the vagueness of the definition, critics argue that this definition of Krasner, which is really a consensus definition, treats regimes as social institutions in the sense of stable sets of rules, roles, and relationships. You see, the idea here is to say that when we talk about regimes, regimes don't always mean that we'll have stable sets of rules, roles, and relationships. Sometimes these things may change over time. You see, a regime could change over time. A regime does not refer to fixed eternal, immutable ways of doing things. Secondly, critics argue that this definition is vague to the extent that it characterizes regimes as issue area specific, in contrast to broader or deeper institutional structure of international society as a whole. So that the idea here is, when you talk about regime must have a bigger picture. We must look at regimes from a bigger picture. Not only a specific issue, but should also be able to address the international scene, the international society, in such a manner that these regimes would mostly be those things that are broad-looking. Therefore, these critics argue that there is perhaps a need to have explicit rules, not just traditions, but explicit rules. Something of an observable behavior, explicit rules that can define observable behavior. Therefore, this leads us to identifying regimes on the basis of observed behavior and then using regimes to explain this behavior. Another criticism is the one that places it that if we look at regimes purely on this definition, we risk having what we can call simply paper regimes and not practical regimes that are to be found within practical scenarios. So you see, this is what we can actually critique of this. Let me talk about this second criticism, and then we look at these elements. Now, you see, there are those who critique this definition, this fourfold definition of international regimes, as being composed of components that cannot be distinguished very easily. You see? For example, they argue that when we are talking about rules, rules are the most concrete and more well-defined of the four components. They are often stated explicitly in formal agreements on which regimes are commonly based. So rules will be found to be the practical instruments. Rules, we talk about treaties, how member states will behave, how parties will behave. Rules facilitate how we will assess the implementation of compliance to that treaty, to that regime. Therefore, we say rules provide us with the specific targets. They provide us with a specific target, and therefore rules imply two conceptions. One, something that happens regularly, that this happens as a rule regularly, that is a routinized behavior. Therefore, regimes define a routine behavior. On the other hand, rules present to us a prescriptive account of how member states should behave. Therefore, from the prescriptive point of view, we argue that rules provide us with a patterned behavior, a pattern of behavior. So this is one and the same time. We are saying that rules here within the definition give us the most concrete, the most practical way of assessing regimes. Now, still talking about those things and looking at the other components of that definition, looking at the other component of that definition, and that's the principles. Principles involve goal orientation. So rules are about, we're talking about those explicit practical behavior, defining what we should do as a result of, routine behavior, patterns of our behaviors, and so forth. Now, principles here, the critics argue, involve a goal orientation. They involve causal beliefs in the context of public policy. For example, we talk about principles when you talk about economics, when you talk about security issues, when you talk about environment. When we talk about principles, we are actually talking about a philosophy that is guiding a regime. So as we'll see later, we could be talking about the philosophy of liberalism. We could be talking about the philosophy of conservatism. We could be talking about the philosophy of individual freedom. So those are principles. From these principles now, rules emerge. You see? Consider the example, for example, of individual freedom as an intervention principle in ending slave trade. So that if you look at the agreements, the national agreements of states, of individuals that came together with an argument of ending slave trade, then you will see a principle lying behind it, a principle, for example, of individual freedom lying behind it, arguing that every individual is born free. So if we argue on that principle, then it derives from that, we derive from that now an international regime that will end up, for example, by saying, if you belong to this set of countries or this community of nations, then you cannot, practice slave trade or so forth. Norms, on the other hand, refer to general rights and obligations that operate mainly on the level of issue areas, norms. For example, you'd be talking about here, common things to talk about reproductive health rights and so forth. When you talk about such things, then you are talking about norms. You're talking about things like human rights, norms. However, norms are still so general that it is often impossible to determine whether or not specific actions violate them or not. So you see, from that kind of discussion, you are able to see the relationship between these elements, these components that make really what we call international regimes, as it were. Now, having said this, we want to conclude this area of understanding what international regimes are by trying to appreciate the elements in these distinctions. Why are these elements, rules, norms, principles, procedures distinguished in this kind of definition? First, we say that the distinction between these elements is to help us gain a descriptive richness, especially in regime analysis. When we are analyzing regimes, we want to know this one operates from which philosophy. Even when we are analyzing how regimes are formed, we want to understand this one operates, or rather, develops from which foundations. These distinctions also, furthermore, makes it possible to classify regimes in ways that may prove useful, especially when you are looking at the process of regime formation and the consequence that result from these regimes. Therefore, in summary, in our understanding of regimes, it is fair to conclude that international regimes are social institutions. They may not be necessarily physical entities, but there are social institutions that consist of agreed upon principles, norms, rules, procedures, and programs that govern the interactions of actors in specific issue areas. So there is an issue. These issues could be things like security. We could be talking about, like terrorism in the world. So we'll have an international regime of security that addresses terrorism. And then, these regimes are domesticated. We'll be talking about trade tariffs within COMESA, within East African Community. So we have the principles, the norms, rules, and procedures that govern this, govern how member states within that kind of situation will behave towards one another, the rights, the obligation of member states. We'll be talking about, for example, who can take which goods to what country, who can sell which goods to what country. And these are the kind of rules, or rather, the kind of agreements that we find in these regimes. Therefore, from this definition, this summative definition, regimes are defined and operationalized in terms of social rules of engagement. Regimes refer to social institutional arrangements of coexistence. So once more again, when we mention institution, we are not necessarily referring to a physical entity. Therefore, regimes give rise to recognized social practices in the international society, and hence regimes are distinct from mere international organizations, which are material entities, because these international organizations are simply products of regimes. As I've said earlier in the earlier slides, international organizations are a subset of international regimes. I'm imagining somebody would like to weigh in on this conceptual understanding of regimes. You see, this conceptual understanding of regimes. So could we have a few hands that would like to participate in this discussion to this extent, please? Any hand?
Well, before
I'm imagining,
yes,
Dr. as we imagine too, a
yes.
question maybe,
Yes.
A group like Al-Qaeda,
Yes.
Al-Shabaab.
Is this all watch speaking?
This is Wekesa speaking, Chris.
Oh, yes, yes. Okay, okay, sir.
I'm imagining a group like Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab. I'm taking a good example of Al-Qaeda being an international group. I don't know if I would consider it a regime or an international terrorist group, because looking at the tenets of what you've explained, they almost sound similar to to the tenets of these particular groups. And so please make me understand whether I should consider Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab as international regimes or international terrorist groups, and if they have the similar tenets as to what you've explained. Thank you.
Would somebody be wishing to respond to Wekesa's question, please? Anybody? Maybe the hands down. Can I assume the hands up would like to respond to that?
Okay,
Florence,
I may.
would you like to respond to that?
I can.
Yes, Florence.
Mwalimu, based on what you've shared around the principles, the norms, the rules, and decision-making procedures of these international regimes, I don't think Al-Qaeda qualifies. The example you gave us of World Trade Organizations and how they came about, it came from a commonality of doing something good around several different countries. And for me, Al-Qaeda do not fall in this space, given what you have just shared with us. And looking at just the final summation you've given us, that international regimes are social institutions consisting of agreed upon principles, norms, rules, procedures, and programs that govern the interactions of actors in specific issue areas. For me, all the examples you've given me not speak of what Al-Qaeda is about. And so that I hesitate to call an Al-Qaeda an institution that speaks to what we are discussing today.
Dr.
Florence,
Dr. Even as my colleagues try to answer me,
yes,
I'll also invite them that we also try to look at the characteristics of these groups and try to make a distinctive the thin line between what you've shared and their characteristics, because apparently I've happened to learn about these groups, and they almost have similar characteristics like what you've shared. Because like if you went deep to study about the terrorist groups, then you will realize that they don't operate from one country, but they have a very serious leadership right from so many countries, with the same agreed principles, norms, rules, leadership procedures, and which are actually hierarchical. And therefore, even as we try to answer this question, I would request that we also look at their characteristics in broad, so that you help me. Thank you.
Very well. I can Oluoch Madiang, your hand has been up. Would you like to respond to this question?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kegode. I also hope you will give me later a chance to
Yes, please.
ask my question. But for now, and I think I will disappoint Florence, based purely on a discussion of the universal characteristics of an international group and all the characteristics that have been shared in here, then even the unmentioned Al-Shabaab, so to speak, Al-Qaeda, may in fact fall within that definition. What that definition didn't explicitly say is the do-goodism or the do-badism of those particular international groups. And I'll give an example. Some time back, the World Bank introduced into Kenya and many Africa countries what is referred to as structural adjustment plans, SAPs. One of the most common results of the SAPs was, for example, in Kenya, the abolition of the field extension officers, who are helping smallholder farmers to be able to produce crops, double in agriculture, based on very solid advice. By abolishing the same, the field extension workers were removed, the technical support went down, and the result of it was low food access to the general communities. What then is terrorism couched in very, very good policy words? So in a sense, even the World Bank, even though it's an international organization, looking deeper, some of the works they do go beyond the immediate kind of shock that Al-Shabaab will do and throw a bomb here in Nairobi, and then it gets really heated up. But since Moi days, we've had 20 years, structural adjustment fund programs are still affecting us. So I give this example to say this, that based only on the characteristics as defined, those organizations then fall into international group A. B, just the definition of terrorism seems to be subjective. What is terrorism to the British colonialist fighting the Mau Mau is sovereign independence to the Kenyan people. What is terrorism to the Israelis is a fight for freedom for the Gazans. So in a sense, just because the media, the ultimate one, produces the term terrorism does not mean an organization is not international. Sorry, Dr. Kegode, for talking too long in that, but that is my point, and I may be very wrong. Over to you.
No, well done, well done. I think let us develop some more voices to this. I can see Boaz. Would we listen to you, Boaz Waruku?
Thank you, Mwalimu. I initially had a question, but let me also raise my voice to this.
Yes.
And I think the speakers were contributing, probably also drawing the issues or the explanations from the definition given by Keohane, where Keohane is actually accepting and indicating that the kind of relationships, the rules as connected are maybe either formal or informal. I suspect that that could be part of where then the conversation we are having is emanating from. But I wanted to add something that touches on then the international law. Why that is important? It's because then the framework that then would define and help clarify the regimes in such a sense, to me, should be one where then the international law frameworks then operate. Because in that case, it would not pass the test if, say, which networks, like the networks in the Latin America and the South Caribbean, who are just formed specifically to deal in drugs across the borders. In such cases, then those networks then do not qualify to become regimes. But then if they are not created or clothed in some kind of well-governed and a set of rules which is understandable as part of the package that we call the international law, then anything might pass. And indeed, I think because human beings are the same ones that are in the collusion of creating, do we call them gangs, the criminal gangs, you know, we have several versions of that. The same human beings that are also organizing to create governments. So you'll find in some states, or maybe, can I give the example of what is happening in Western Africa currently? That the overthrow of what I would call, in quote, democratically elected governments through coup d'etats, and it appears that the coup d'etats are now in union and are working together. And indeed, they're even encouraging other countries to exhibit or to act along that line. And is there not emerging a pattern of some regime that with time, it can just become an international regime? So for me, that's why I wanted us to cement it and frame it within the international law, because then that would help us to be more clear on what qualifies as an international regime and not. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry, I realized I was muted while speaking. Sorry for that. So I'm indicating that I may not comment on that question now. I'm taking time so that we discuss the theories. Once we discuss the theories that guide these regimes, then we can be in a position to be able to comment on this much more in a better manner. Now, I'm going to build some arguments that will inform this. Of course, I'm aware.
Sorry, Dr. Kegode. Dr. Kegode, sorry for jumping in.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so the concern I wanted to raise, and I don't know whether it is just academics, is that after you gave us the definition, I think the definition of the regime, you've concentrated so much on what critics kind of tear apart that definition. So much so that at some point I was feeling like, oh, we are really dismissing a definition based on critics. And I was even about to say, why can't these critics make their own definitions?
Come again on that. Come again. Sorry, I missed you. Come again.
Yeah, I thought that we are concentrating so much on how much the critics are tearing up a definition than how much that provided definition is actually responding to the need for a definition. I just found that we concentrated too much on the critics. Is this an academic thing, or maybe I'm just wrong? I thought we would also have the other side of it, the positives about that definition. That was the concern I had. Over.
Good. Perhaps approach-wise, not just academic, because finally we must be able to talk about these things in very practical situations. And perhaps the organization of these slides is that it puts the theories ahead, so that these theories would like to see them, how they come into practice. Could we just give it a moment, maybe 5 minutes, and then we revisit this again?
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. So we now look at the specific features of international regimes. Now, you see, talking about regimes, I need to re-emphasize. You see, a regime has something to do with people, states coming together. Sometimes we have even individual actors will be able to see that. They surrender some rights. They enter into either formal or informal agreements, but bind each one of them to behave in a particular manner. So one of the things, you see, this is being carried over from the definition side. So one of the essential features of international regimes that we carry from that kind of definition is that there is an explicit commitment given by signatories. So this means that all parties are supposed to fulfill their obligations, of course. It could be monetary obligations, maybe paying up some money towards this. It could be physical contribution, e.g., taking troops to that country, each one of us taking troops to that country in peacekeeping or something. There is also what we call, we're discussing really the basic features of international regimes. So one, that explicit commitment, on each side, on each member, a member must demonstrate a willingness to fulfill obligation. That willingness to fulfill an obligation indicates an explicit commitment to the regime. Second, we have what we call the ideological framework. A basic feature of international regime is an ideological framework. Now, this ideological framework is now what we are going to discuss later as the theories of international regimes. We're talking about things like liberalism, things like concepts like realism. You see, how do you look at this issue? In fact, that should give us a lens through which we look at some of these issues, call them Al-Qaeda, call them whatever. How do we look at this issue? We'll be talking about here even on things like we talk about human rights, and on the basis of human rights, people want to talk about, for example, LGBTQ. You see, what philosophy, what ideology is pushing this, such that a president of a given country can visit another country and talk to the president of that country in a manner to say, please legalize LGBTQ. Ideological framework is a basic feature in international regime. So you see, we'll be looking at this ideological framework to be able to see what are they. And then thirdly, a basic feature in international regime is that national power will normally dictate the nature of regimes. And now, national power will reveal the national interest, so that as countries come together, as countries surrender a bit of their rights to that regime and put their signature, become signatories to that. As for example, when we have an international regime, say something to do with education, something to do with the perhaps trade, something to do with the health, which is passed at the international level, then other nations are asked to domesticate that kind of a regime. Normally, elements of national interest will come to play, so that when you talk about even, for example, IMF and World Bank, this will be controlled. You know, by the end of the day, this will be controlled by some power somewhere. IMF is not just, you know, a body there for all members who are signatory to it. World Bank is not just an institution there where all members are equal. No, there are countries that invest most in World Bank, for example. For example, here we're mentioning China and United States of America. Whoever pays the piper calls the tune. So because they invest most, the national interest will be higher than somebody who is coming there simply to ask for a loan. They will dictate the tariffs, the loans, the interest on those loans. Therefore, international regimes are not totally independent of these isolated individual interests. As much as we talk about international regimes, people are coming together to agree on something. Still, even in the United Nations organization, you'll find a few countries that will be named as having veto power over certain things. It's as if we are trying to consent that within international regimes, as much as we are trying to encourage cooperation and not competition, the owners exist, and these owners will try to exercise greater power than the other members within that kind of regime. Now, having looked at those features, we look at the rationale. I'm trying to speed up this so that we can reach those slides that will help us address some of the questions we've raised. Did I hear a hand up, a voice?
Yes, because just that previous slide, Mwalimu.
Please.
It basically then indicate to us, and using your own examples, that then these international regimes can actually just be one single, say, administration of a powerful country, establishing a sphere and just bringing others as flower girls. And then in that case, it becomes very difficult because, for example, when you use the World Bank, that was the International Bank for Reconstruction, as you put it rightly, that was supposed to help reconstruct Europe. And no wonder, even up to date, it becomes very difficult for the global South, the Africans and the Latin America, the Asians and all that, to find a stronghold within there. That's why, I mean, the US always, they are the ones who appoint and determine who the president of the World Bank is. And then they give Europe now the opportunity to have the managing director, the head of the IMF. And so then in that kind of framing, the features then that we were looking at maybe can start falling off one by one, Mwalimu. Thank you.
You are right. You are right. You are right.
Mwalimu, may I say something on that?
This is Florence speaking.
Yes.
Yes, Florence.
I had an experience of interviewing when I was a very young girl, interviewing the late Biwott when he was Minister for Trade, when he had just come back from signing the WTO agreement, which opened up African markets or opened up the global South to free trade, and besides seeing the issue of influx of sugar and all that. And one question I asked is that, what did you commit our nation to? And he said the document was so big that when I was on the flight, I just signed. As I was heading, I just signed. I did not have time to read. So I think one of these things and the issues my brother is raising, again, back to our leadership, that as leaders, when we sign off our countries to certain treaties, agreements, and regimes, do we read the fine print on what we are exposing the next generation to? I just thought I should share that. Thank you.
Yeah, Macho, you are right, Florence, in the sense that, in fact, the easiest example sometimes I always give, when we take loans in a bank and they give you a write-up, a big write-up, to put it sarcastically, in very small prints, in very small prints. And there is somebody in the bank. Please, by this, I'm not attacking the bankers in class. There is somebody in the bank who will always tell you, no, sign here, and will put a star where you should sign. When you try to look at the thing, say, no, just sign here. It is said that later on, when really time comes and you are defaulting on something you never understood about, is when now those letters will be boldened and you'll be told you signed this. I think, Florence, you are shedding light on that as we domesticate, regimes, it's very important to be able to know what we are really committing societies, committing nations towards. Taslin Otieno, you'd like to say something about this, Taslin?
I also just have a rejoinder on what Florence just said. There's this thing called COP or COP22, like it's been happening for a minute, and it talks about climate justice. And right now, as we stand, Africa has only like emitted 5 of the carbon emission or something. But then now they're telling us that the developed nations, which have contributed like 30%, 40, 50%, are telling us that we have to stop. Yet it's the industrialization that has helped them to get where they are. So how are we going to get there without industrialization? Because that is what they used to develop themselves. So sometimes maybe some of these agreements that we get into are maybe detrimental to us. I don't know. Thank you.
Very well, Taslin, and I think I would say the animal farm seems to be what we're talking about. Eugene Situma, you'd like to say something about this, Eugene?
Thank you, Daktari. Indeed, I think the previous conversation had made me curious in terms of the formation. Yeah, is there a limit to the number of states that would be involved? And then I think I was also curious about the purpose. I don't know if we are going to learn about that, because I think then it would define whether a terrorist organization is an international regime or not. So those were some of the areas I had. And then I also wanted to find out if an example like the ICRC, the Red Cross, is considered an international regime. Thank you.
Very well. We can see whose hand is this. I'm seeing the hand of Manyara. You'd like to conclude this discussion? Manyara?
Yes. Good evening, Dr.
Yes, good evening to you.
I like today's discussion about the international regimes. And I want to contribute by going a little bit back to what had been asked about terrorism vis-a-vis the established government. Because I'm looking at the definition and the characteristics of regimes, and there is a cutting characteristic in all of that, sharing a particular common norm. And it might not be easy to differentiate between the two. It depends, as I think Madiang said, on who labels the other as terrorist. Looking at the international regime we are looking at, when several governments come together for one common purpose, you might find sometimes that common purpose negates the right of other countries. For example, if you look at the waters of Lake Victoria, the way those agreements were done then, and Egypt is still stuck on the same, that we have to use those particular rules and laws of sharing the Nile waters. And we know that Ethiopia contributes almost 75% of the Nile water, and then we have Lake Victoria. So the regimes goes with the interests of the groupings that are coming in together to define them. And you look at terrorists also, they have some common features. If you look at Al-Qaeda, the Al-Shabaab subscribed to Al-Qaeda. We have Al-Qaeda in North Africa. We have Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. And they're looking at a shared grief against the West and their cultures. So sometimes you might find, if we use that term, they are all terrorists, without looking deeply into why they emerged, then we can have a problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madiang. Thank you very much. And I think, this issue of interest, there are issues that we need to look at very keenly. And besides that, to be able to look at reasons, the rationale, the why regimes come around. Let's therefore look at the next slide that we believe should be able to help us to understand the rationale, the reasons why regimes come up. We present to ourselves here 4 reasons, 4 arguments behind the rationale for international regimes. Why international regimes? Why do we need international regimes? For example, why do even those that we call superpowers still need international regimes? Why are the weak nations, the smaller nations, still need the international regimes? 1, international regimes exist principally to foster cooperation, as we said in some slides ago, so that we can emphasize cooperation and not competition. So regimes exist, international regimes exist to foster cooperation among national states so as to promote relations. Again, as we have really given our interventions to this, even when we talk about fostering cooperation and even talking about promoting international relations, still there is always the issue, who pays? Who pays gains the most? Who pays is able to protect his or her interests most? We're talking about the East African community, for example. Who pays most? Whose interests will be safeguarded most? Will be an interplay really of power struggles there. The other reason why international regimes exist is that enduring need to condition behavior of nation states consciously so that we can lead ourselves to the realization of collective goals. The idea here is, remember, these international regimes sometimes may involve informal agreements. But you see, when we bring in international regimes in the context of signing agreements, signing treaties, is so that we can push the nation state consciously, deliberately, so that we can realize specifically set collective goals. Again, here, we are thinking about the East African community. When you talk about the treaties signed on various, levels, whether it is a common market, whether it is one currency, whether it is political integration and so forth, you see, these treaties, these regimes will help to push the member nation states consciously deliberately. And that's why, you'll find the different parliaments being asked to domesticate these principles, sign these principles, domesticate these rules, domesticate these norms, domesticate these procedures within their boundaries, their national boundaries. Thirdly, the rationale for international regimes again rests on the need to reduce uncertainty in certain fields. You see, we're talking about, for example, we'll be looking at some slides when you talk about international waters, territorial boundaries. You're talking about another nation having to fly his planes, his warplanes across that. We're talking about, for example, the British, the Americans having to train their soldiers in Kenya. It cannot just be them bringing those soldiers and they're there, being trained. There must be a kind of an agreement, a kind of a regime that allows the Americans, the Britons, to have their military interests, located in all these countries around the world and the like. Therefore, if we were not to have international regimes, then, we will not be sure of the outcome of the uncertainties because we never committed ourselves to a certain direction of thinking, a certain direction of expectations. Remember, in the definition of what international regimes are, we always also underline that these nation states, these actors are coming together and defining their expectations. You see, these expectations will bind each member within that regime. The fourth argument why we need international regime is that international regimes create order in multiplicity of state interests. Here we're talking about once several countries come together, I think again, I use the example of the East African community. When they come together, every nation has its own interests. Look at, for example, let's come home and give an example of education, for example, education curriculum, for example. You see, every nation may want to train its children in a particular manner. But, we'll have something like, nowadays we talk about what we call the competence-based learning. We're talking about, for example, the 21st century learning skills, which actually nobody may have signed on this formally. But you see, there is the adoption of those, the so-called the 21st century education skills or education competencies being adopted in various national curricula around the world. So that we are trying to say in this number 4, that each country may have its own interests on something. This interest could be educational interests, could be trade interests, could be political interests, could be, for example, on the political lane, we'll be talking about a country that has the expansionist tendencies. We are having 3-4 countries bordering one another, and each one of them has expansionist tendencies. For example, Kenya and Uganda. Kenya would want to argue that up to somewhere in Uganda should be his land, or up to some point in Lake Victoria should be his territory. Uganda would want to argue, no, up to some point inside Kenya should be his territory. That's what we're talking about. In the context of this multiplicity of state interests, we need international regime to create order, especially where there exists no common state interests, when we don't have common state interests and just every state has its own, unique interests. Then you need these regimes to try and bring this kind of order. Now, this slide that we are beginning, that is projected before us, is now to take us through what now technically we call international regime theories. International regime theories. As I said much earlier, you see, every regime that we have, would it be a World Bank regime? Will it be an international, whatever, World Trade Organization regime? Would it be environmental sustainability regime? These things you find, nations meeting in given capitals of the world and come up with a regime with a statement around what will guide them perhaps for the next 5, 3, 4 years or so forth. Any of these international regimes will be found to be founded on a specific theory. You see, these theories sometimes may converge within a regime. So, keenly, let us follow this about 3 or so slides that are supposed to take us through what technically we refer to as international regime theories. These are regimes that explain, these are theories that explain how regimes emerge and what would be the principal focus within a given regime. Now, the first theory of international regimes is what we call the realist theory, or simply realism. The realist theory, or simply realism. Now, the realist theory understands that the nation states are the primary drivers of international regimes. So according to realists, it is not that gang group there. It is not that individual. You see, we'll be looking at certain theories that will actually help us to see that behind even what we call nation states, there could just be one individual, one powerful, rich individual. No, this is an academic discussion, and here we are not going just to raise names to accuse people. But when I say this, you understand. You're talking about regimes around health. You could discover that there is an individual, a single individual that, for example, is investing money into, kind of health investigations, investigations to do with the health issues. And this person will call the shots. You'll find an individual investing money, for example, in the production of vaccines, and is able to decide which vaccines go to which country. Were we talking about corona vaccines? Were we talking about whatever vaccines? This is what we're talking about. Now, against that kind of background, we are saying the realist theory argues that it is not individuals. Remember, theories take a position about a particular issue. So realists argue it is not an individual that takes the center stage. It is not a group of people within a country that takes a center stage, but is simply the nation state itself. So nation states are the primary drivers of international regime. So the interests of the nation states, according to realists, should take the center stage in defining international regimes. Now, realism as a theory operates on the basis of 3 important elements. That is, 1, we talk about the statism, the statism. 2nd, we talk about survival. 3rd, we talk about the need to help self, what we call self-help. Now, the first feature, the first element that defines realism as a theory of international regime, which we call statism, holds that the state is the main actor and that the state is understood to be a rational actor. You remember in policy formulation, when we talked about, the rational model, when we argued that, you see, we are, as it were, surrendering our rights to the state, surrendering our rights maybe through elections, and we believing that this person has the best interest of the society. He's rational, has the best understanding of what the society needs. So realism believes that the state, that animal we want to call the state, has the best interest of the nation. The state is a rational actor. And that is what one of our, I think, contributors was saying. I think it must have been Florence was saying some minutes ago. You see, whether that person you interviewed understood or not, whether that thing being brought before the president, whether the president reads it or not, whether they need to domesticate that international regime from the World Trade Organization, whether it is understood or not, once it is enacted, once it is domesticated, you see, it is domesticated not in the name of the very person signing it, in the name of the Minister of Finance, in the name of the President, but it is enacted in the name of the state which is to be understood always as a rational actor, acting in the best interest of its citizens. That's why, I don't know, but I'll be inviting you to ventilate on this, the extent to which perhaps future generations, for example, talking about Kenya, can argue that we will not pay this debt because we were not consulted, or those who took it, did not use it well, or whatever it is, or the proceeds of that debt were not converted into the national finance kitty or something of that kind. So the basic element in realism is the state is a rational actor. It makes the decision because it acts in the best interest of the citizens. The second feature in realism as a theory of international regime is that we ask ourselves, what is the aim? So realism explains that the aim of international regime is to guarantee the state's survival. So realism will paint a picture of what I say, we call it a Hobbesian state of nature, which is a state of anarchy, a brutish state, and would argue in order for the state to survive, it must actually ascend itself to this international regime so that it is protected by that regime. Because then if you are not a member of that regime, then the state is not safe. We're trying to argue that through loans and whatever it is, the state is struggling to survive economically, technologically, whatever it is. So that's why we are trying to say here again, the state is at the center and regimes exist to guarantee state survival. That is realism. Thirdly, self-help, you see, is an intertwined argument. These threefold features are in an intertwined argument. Self-help means that there is a need for the state to help itself. Therefore, because there is a need for the state to help itself, therefore this leads to the state to enter these international regimes. This is slightly different from just the second argument of survival. You see, survival looks at it that if you don't enter the international regime, other states may swallow you. You might not exist. Self-help is an argument that you enter this international regime because of the interests, the benefits, the gains you are going to get from that international regime. It could be material gains and so forth. It could be protection, for example, and so forth. So the reason for international regimes, according to the realist theory, focuses squarely on power distribution. That is, realism focuses on the need to enter international regimes so that states can control power and avoid anarchy. States can control power and avoid anarchy. Now, besides what we are calling realism as a theory of international regimes, we also have what we call liberalism. Liberalism is a second theory of international regimes. Remember,
sorry.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
The previous slide for realism, maybe you can repeat that last statement, the reason for that, where there is that point.
All right. We're talking about three reasons. That's the statism. And, these are actually explanations of realism as a theory of international regime. You see, explaining why international regimes or how international regimes come to exist based on realist theory. One, the state. The state is understood as a rational actor. Therefore, it is the main actor and not individuals. You know, we'll be talking later to talk about NGOs, for example, take an active role in regime construction. According to realism, NGOs, United Nations Organization, take no role in this. It is the state. It's as if to say, if you are talking about loans, if you are talking about financial obligations of the state, you cannot blame an individual. It is the state. Second, realism as a theory of international regime is based on an argument around the aim. Why international regimes? When you ask realists, why should we have international regimes? The answer from realists is for the state to survive. Without international regimes, you know, nations would be in a state of anarchy. What we call in philosophy would be in a Hobbesian state of nature. You see, a state of nature, you know, a law of the jungle. They'll be exposed to a law of the jungle. The man eat man society, you know, would be that, you know, these things, this second argument, you know, I'll be saying there are a lot of criticisms against this second argument, the aim. Because you see, we're talking about here where a nation can come and mine, you know, another nation's minerals, for example. You know, of course, today they'll hide behind the small, you know, let me call them quote unquote small international regimes that we've agreed to be here for this whatever period of time, will provide this and do this. But you are understanding the state needs to survive. Therefore, it gets into this international regime so that it can protect itself against being wounded by the law of the jungle. Then the self-help, a little bit intertwined to the second argument, though different. Self-help. See, the second argument is really to protect the self against the anarchy, to protect the self against the anarchy. The third argument is now not this survival, but you get there for those, let me call it, the material gains you'll get from the international regimes for self-help. And that's why we'll give here examples of the loans that, for example, a country will take from World Bank, whatever it will take from, you know, they talk about technical advice. The technical advisors from IMF are visiting Kenya, and some people will take this very, very seriously. So self-help. If you wanted to look at, I'm just saying if you wanted to look at the International Red Cross Society as a regime, then you'll understand when you are, you know, you are entering an international regime, you know, that is founded on Red Cross, for example, then you are getting into it, not because of the second reason, but because of this, the third reason, to help yourself, you know, to help yourself. Therefore, that's what we're trying to conclude by saying the reasons for international regimes under realism focus on power distribution. Realists want to say we enter international regimes so that we can control power that various states have and be able to avoid anarchy. I think you get that, eh? Good. So we're talking about the second theory, which we're calling liberalism. And liberalism here, a little bit just the opposite of an offshoot of realism here. You see, whereas we talked about those three focal points in realism, liberalists focus on the need to promote peace and prosperity. These are really elements that liberalists will focus on most. The need to promote peace and prosperity. Therefore, liberalists, you know, realists would be arguing in a manner that, you know, even given states should be whipped, whether they understand or not. They should be whipped towards this regime. That's why the argument would be, you must domesticate this. It's good for you. You must domesticate this, whether you understand or not. Some people would argue here with a bit of humor. You know, when you talk about baptism, for example, in the ancient times, you know, one would argue, what about those populations that had their own religions? They don't understand the need for Christian baptism. And humor is presented of some bishop in Northern Africa who advised his pastors that as you go around, baptize those people by force, whether they like it or not. Don't seek to explain to them so that they understand. You seek they understand. No, baptize them by force. And his argument was, when you baptize them by force, you know, later on when they get to heaven, they'll understand how good it was. This is realism. This is a realist argument. But you see, when you are talking about liberalism, liberalism is talking about the need to dialogue and promote peace and prosperity. So international regimes that will be founded on liberalism will involve a lot of discussions. That's why, for example, in this second case, you'll find like the environmental sustainability discussions. You'll find people go to whatever conference, come up with an agenda, discuss it, people give papers, people give positions. Then at the end, they are coming up with a conclusion, you know, position paper. And they argue that we have agreed on this, therefore member states to go and domesticate this. So liberalism as a regime theory is focusing on the need to dialogue and come up with a need to promote peace and prosperity. So liberalism will be founded majorly, will be based majorly on really on the basis of information or knowledge and the joint mutual gains or benefits. You see, when if I compare with the previous theory, you see realism is about self-interest of a nation state. You know, a nation enters into an international regime so that it can protect its own. No, the emphasis is on its own interest. Remember, realism is being advocated in what I'm repeatedly calling a Hobbesian state of nature, the law of the jungle. Now, when we talk about liberalism, liberalism is talking about the need for mutual agreements. You know, so you are talking about joint mutual gains or benefits based on the information, on the knowledge you have. Therefore, according to liberalism as a regime theory, the basic rationale for international regimes is to overcome what we call the prisoner dilemma in international relations, to overcome what we call the prisoner dilemma in international relations. Prisoner dilemma in international relations is normally explained. You can read about this on the internet, whatever is explained there. It's normally summed up in those 4 points I'm putting in the slide, that prisoner dilemma pictures a case whereby there are two parties, two people, two prisoners with the competing interests. You know, they are perhaps locked, each one of them locked in a different room. They kind of have some secrets and, you know, they have competing interests. Now, they are unable to communicate to each other. So they must each choose between either cooperating with the other or not. Now, you see, they are chained together somehow. So if they cooperate, you know, if it's like talking about CMS twins, if they cooperate, they stand to benefit. They'll go they'll go to places together. You know, they reach out, so there is mutual benefit. If they don't cooperate, if they don't communicate, if they choose they don't want to communicate, then all lose. So this element of prisoner's dilemma in international relations is actually the heart of liberalism, which is emphasizing that the highest reward given to two states who have competing interests is when they come together to cooperate, to communicate, to sign treaties, so that, you see, they can all gain something. But if they don't sign that treaty, it's as if none of them will gain anything, you know, in that kind of scenario. That's what, so liberalism is really explained in that prisoner's dilemma. The need for nation states to come together and be able to communicate. I can see the hand of Florence March once more again.
Yeah, Mwalimu, I was just thinking, does the fall of the East African community, as it were in the beginning, be attributed to prisoners' dilemma? Because all these years now, countries, the 3 East African countries now expanded to more, have been struggling to get together and try to negotiate things as a team. And you always see how one feels slighted when another goes and discusses something on their own. Could we attribute it to that?
Yeah, I think so. That one I think so, because we're talking about, like, if you look at the collapse in the 70s, and one, of course, you will understand it was mainly because of ideological differences. You know, there is this talk about ideological differences, especially between Tanzania and Kenya. You know, Kenya representing the radical capitalism, and Tanzania representing what you'd call not communism, but represent what you call African egalitarianism, communalism, as it were. And you notice that these two people, these two parties together, they have something. You know, Tanzanians representing something of value, Kenya representing of something of value. Now, if they dialogue, they all benefit. If they choose not to dialogue and remain, you know, arguing for one's interest, they all lose and the community collapses. I think we should be able to say, Florence, that we are watching again. For those who are following, who are good students of international relations, I'm sure you are following these things with the timelines of the East African community and the like. I saw Madiang's hand up again. Madiang? Maybe Madiang is not available now. We make progress for now. Maybe it's a previous hand. We make some progress. So you understand, I think we are able to appreciate the fundamental difference between realism and liberalism. You know, put differently, realism is as if to say the real situation, the actual situation on the ground is that different specific nation states are pursuing their national interests in a kind of an anarchy kind of state of nature, a brutish state of nature, a law of the jungle. International regimes are coming in to heal that law of the jungle. Liberalism is an argument that no, it's not an issue of the law of the jungle, but really we need to promote peace and prosperity. Therefore, there is something that each one of us stands to benefit from this. So that the prisoner's dilemma is to emphasize the fact that, look here, if you move this way, you gain. Now, the third theory, because really here I had 3 theories to be looked at. The third theory of these international regimes is what we call the hegemonic stability theory, the hegemonic stability theory. Follow this argument here very closely because I would like us to develop some arguments around this. You see, the concept hegemony implies dominance of one nation state, of one country over the others. So when we say this, I think read through the practical scene of international relations today. Hegemonic stability theory. Understanding the concept, hegemony. Hegemony implies you have a domineering state, a domineering power, a kind of a nation state that exercises its domineering power over other states. So that the hegemonic stability theory would hold that states can only cooperate economically with one another when that state that has hegemonic power holds the ring economically or militarily. It's as if the hegemonic stability theory argues that for there to be order, for there to be cooperation, the hegemony must actually hold in his hand, the cane. Kiboko must hold the cane so that that hegemony can police other states. Now, this cane, this authority that the hegemony must hold in his hand could be an economic cane, could be a military cane, could be a cultural cane, and so forth. That's why we are saying the hegemony can be economic, can be military, or cultural, and can be exercised in various ways. Therefore, we talk about economic coercion. Economic coercion, so that through World Bank, the story will be, remember what we've seen from the previous slides. Who holds the sway in World Bank? The country that invests in World Bank the most, the one that has the highest shares. You're talking about those of you who work in the banking sector, those of you who work in this cooperative society sector. You see, as much as we'll talk about, we'll be having an annual general meeting, whoever has the highest number of shares within that circle, within that bank, within whatever, within family bank or within whatever bank, will have the sway. So the hegemony is able to exercise its authority. It could be through economic coercion. So World Bank will come in and will say, you will hear that World Bank has advised Kenya. The words will be very soft diplomatic words, that Kenya has received this advice from World Bank. But it's not as soft as it sounds, that it is an advice for taking or ignoring. No, it's actually an economic coercion, that this and this should go up. Whatever dollar. You may want to say, no, we are not going to do our trade, using dollars. We are going to do our trade using our own money, whatever. That's good for talking. But when push comes for push, where really the rubber touches the ground, there'll be economic coercion. You must do this so that you can get this. It could also be military coercion, military force as it were. So you see, once more again, you're talking about these situations. You're talking about situations in Ukraine. You're talking about the situations in the Gaza Street. You're talking about all these situations. And you will discover behind these things, there could be a hegemony, and that's why others cannot move near. There'll be a kind of a military force. There would also be what we call ideological influence. Where are you seen to lean? If you lean towards the East, are you leaning towards the East? Therefore, China, whatever, India, whatever, or are you leaning towards the West? Ideological influence. So this is how the hegemony would be able to operate. And that's why I'm summoning each one of us to reflect on what we see in the world today. Consider the presence of a dominant state. The presence of a dominant state can create a sense of predictability and stability in international systems, so that, once we have, the understanding here is that once we have this hegemony state, a dominant state, it can now move, if it is well-intentioned, it can now move and create a sense of predictability, because people, other nation states, will look at that hegemony as a prefect. And because of that, that state can guarantee stability through international systems. Think also of other states that will now be made to rely on the dominant state to provide the leadership and address global challenges. So the argument would be, what does such and such a state do? You see, even in our ordinary talking, the power of hegemony finds itself in our classrooms, finds itself in our civilizations, so that children grow up, and when they quote, you see, in America, they do this. Even when they don't understand what they are referring to, they argue. In America, they do this. But you see, there are certain things which whereas Americans would stand to dictate other nations on here there was democracy, here it was not democratic. Look at the nature of democracy, for example, in the various nations, for example. Sorry for that. Look at the nature of democracy in various countries, for example. For example, when you come to Africa, you talk about what we call numerical democracy, whereby the masses are going to the polling station to vote. When you go to the Americans, the US, you meet what we call the aristocratic democracy. Those who finally dictate who leads America, democracy by the rule, as the rule of the best. So you see, they understand masses may not reason. So they come up with this college of electors. But you see, were you to come around and argue for the college of electors, somebody will say, no, we are talking about universal suffrage. So these are the kind of situation that we must ask ourselves about. The argument here under hegemonic stability theory is that international regime by hegemony, but its substance, the substance of that regime, would always reflect the epistemic consensus that are found in those states. What we mean here, I want to use, for argument's sake, I want to use an example, but I hope this example does not injure anybody in class. Take it purely for an example. With no moral positions attached to it. You see, the example I want to use is that, look here, for example, the American society, the American nation believes that perhaps in the name of, human rights, LGBTQ rights is the direction to go. And you see, the president of America takes upon himself to come to Africa, to visit a country in Africa, to visit Kenya or whatever country, and, dares to address the public and, address this issue of LGBTQ and argue for why LGBTQ rights must be, guaranteed within the instruments of law in the country. You see that. So if that argument is to go on, you see, we are supposed, the argument here is that we are supposed to move closer to something of liberalism and discuss it based on epistemic. Epistemic means knowledge consensus, based on what we know, based on objective epistemic consensus. Epistemic to mean based on knowledge consensus. So the argument under hegemonic stability theory would be that the regime is being created by hegemony, by the hegemony, but the substance of that regime is reflecting, knowledge consensus in that country. I think this is a discussion that one would take to a higher ground, especially if you are to discuss the issue of LGBTQ in Uganda. Then, with the sober minds, not saying that Uganda are wrong or they are right, simply with the sober minds, we are talking about foreign powers. You've seen even the Americans coming up and say, no, they will advance some economic sanctions against Uganda for taking that position. Meaning the hegemony here is not keen to observe, epistemic consensus being developed from that country, but it is arguing that, no, my position should have been taken. But in the proper sense of hegemonic stability theory is that the international regime, though created by the hegemony, must be able to maintain the substance that reflects the knowledge agreement within a given society. I must have seen some two hands up. Yes. Yes. Any of those two hands, please?
Hi, Mwalimu. This is
Yes,
Florence.
please. Yes, please.
I'm just looking, as you were talking, the example that I had noted down when you were explaining hegemony was how the US, depending on which government comes in, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, the conversations around the gag rule, the Roe versus Wade issue comes up again on matters abortion. And also it almost decides on how the US will fund UNFPA, which is a global body that also supports countries in the South and others around access to contraception. And so even certain NGOs end up not getting funding depending on who is ruling, whether it's the Democrats and the Republicans, and also depending on where a particular state leans. Is the state leaning towards Republican or is the state leaning towards Democrats? Thank you.
Very well, very well, very well. I think noted. I saw Madiang's hand again up. Did I? No. Perhaps Madiang, you hold your hand. I give a chance to Joel, who has not talked to us. Joel Nyamwita.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. and good evening. Now, as you were explaining these theories, when you arrived at hegemony, something struck my mind, and maybe I can share it, and the rest of the class may also guide on the same thought. That I am looking at hegemony as a result. I think that most states come first with a realism kind of perspective that they are both going to defend their personal interest. This is their hidden agenda. They have a hidden agenda first to protect their personal interest. However, to achieve this, they promote to a weaker country the idea of liberalism. That is where they say that if we work together, if we agree to compromise on your values and we compromise on some of our values, you will benefit and we shall benefit. But in the process, as it uses liberalism as a means, it actually weakens the values of the other state and creates a false image of codependence between the two of them. While in reality, this first or the bigger state is still pursuing its realistic agenda, which is to protect itself. Finally, when it has weakened the one state through liberalism, it then now becomes hegemonic because now it has all the powers. So initially they came and said, we are helping you restructure after colonization and you need to work with us. This is what will benefit. But then now we depend on them. We depend on the IMF and they decide who we trade with. And so it has become hegemonic. but has followed all the theories, with realism being its hidden agenda, liberalism being its channel, and hegemonic powers being the results. I think that's what I wanted to share with the class. If someone can also add a piece on that and direct my thought on the same. Thank you very much.
Yes, anybody? I can see the hand of Faith Nzuki. Nzuki?
Yes,
Faith
good
Nzuki.
evening, Daktari. Yes.
Good evening to you. Yes.
So my concern is just short. I was linking the hegemonic stability theory with the realism theory because I think they try to communicate the same thing. Because when you look at the hegemony, you find that countries try to get into these regimes so that they can get the same protection, so that they can get the same economic cohesion, because they would wish to get maybe funds from the whips, from the hegemonic. And again, when you go to realism, they are going to get that self-help and to get the material things that they get from the regimes. So I was trying to link the same, that they go almost hand in hand. That was my thinking, Daktari.
Yeah, very good. You see, Faith, I'm just thinking with the what other speakers have given. I'm just thinking together and trying to see. You see, in the final analysis, these theories come together. They complement one another. For example, come to think of this. Again, with the due respect to different people's moral bearings, come to think of this. Why would a certain superpower, call it a hegemony for that reason? Why would it, for example, go outside there in the name of fundamental human rights to argue for, say, really here, I'm careful about the moral bearings of people, argue for example, the LGBTQs, the reproductive health rights. You see, as much as you'd want to look at them arguing for these issues in the name of what those people will gain in the name of fundamental rights, we must also see the element of these nations and these non-government organizations, creating markets for their products, as it were. We're talking about a world whereby when we talk about issues of vaccines, I mentioned, that are kind of enclaved in a lot of mystery, a lot of arguments. Some people have argued how safe are vaccines, whatever. Some people have argued how best are third world nations suited to test the safety of some of these vaccines and the medicines, whatever. Some people have argued that the third world has become a dumping ground to some of these things, as it were. How do you explain these things when you find, for example, we'll see that in some slides to come, when you find, for example, there is one individual, there is one individual's company, which wants to be the sole marketer of these goods, of these elements across the world. We are talking about, for example, why is the name disappearing again? I'm trying to wrestle with the name. We are talking about Bill Gates, for example, Bill Gates. And one would want to argue, what does Bill Gates, stand to benefit from this? Is it simply for humanitarian reasons that these things are being done? You see, this is why I'm trying to say, behind the so-called hegemony, where this hegemony will be looked at in the name of, a nation, a super nation like the USA or UK, whatever European Union, whether this hegemony would be looked at in the name of an individual standing behind the political regime in America, so that what the political regime does, whether they are Democrats or whatever it is, or Republicans, that there'll be somebody standing behind that political regime with the kind of limitless pockets, and is financing these things. So whether that person becomes the hegemony, whether the nation itself becomes the hegemony, then they are coming in and they would dupe other nations into a liberalist discussion that let us discuss this. But in doing this, really, there is self-interest involved. They want to fulfill their interest. Ochami, you'd like to say something about this? Ochami?
Before Chami comes in, can I just ask a question?
Yes, who is that? I didn't see the hand up. Who is that?
This is Taslin.
Taslin, good.
Yes. So there is a possibility of an individual becoming, I don't know if it's hegemonic or like an individual becoming dominant and not a state towards another state.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's just what I wanted to know.
Yeah, I think I've given that explanation. There's Ochami.
Thank you, Dr. Good evening.
Good evening to you.
I think for me, when we speak about hegemonic, I see so many recent examples, especially in our country. For example, we had the finance bill where some of the initiatives were actually backed by the Bretton Woods institutions, things like the housing levy, the higher taxation, that resulted in us being taxed higher amounts towards purportedly resolving a housing crisis that may not actually be the root cause, for lack of a better word. Then just yesterday, we came off a holiday, a national tree planting holiday, where apparently we received some money. The government received close to 75 billion shillings from the IMF towards the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically the climate change. And for this, then the government needed to demonstrate some action. So that then explains why we needed to then create a national holiday out of the blues, just to ensure that we are on the right track with them. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. I think that's noted. So let's I think we are able to see how really these three theories that we have looked at can coalesce together and still address the same issue. So we now move to the question of how we classify regimes. How do we classify regimes? We start by asking ourselves, why classify regimes? We classify regimes so that we can facilitate the formulation of a hypothesis about how regimes will be formed and how the consequence of regimes would be analyzed. We also classify regimes so that we can account for the variations in the outcome of these international regimes. You see, by referring to character of these institutions, this character of these institutions would be talking about whether we're talking about endogenous variables, that is internally caused originated variables, or variables that are actually exogenous, that are coming from out. So we classify regimes so that we can be able to account that on this consequence of this regime in this country, is this consequence as a result of internally caused elements, or are they as a result of externally caused elements? So to be able to do that kind of evaluation, it's important we classify regimes. Now, there are various ways we can classify regimes. I present to you two ways we can classify regimes. One, we can talk about functional regimes by simply looking at the principles and the norms that govern these regimes. We can talk about functional regimes. Now, functional, from the word functional, to function, to work, regimes that are pragmatic regimes, function to mean pragmatic regimes. These functional regimes exhibit a higher degree of institutionalization, so that you see the regime begins by kind of an agreement, then moves on very quickly to acquire that, what we call the physical entity, the material entity. So there is a higher degree of institutionalization. No, these functional regimes are more difficult to create. No, they are more involving to create, more difficult to create. But take note that once they are created, or once they come into existence, only as part of a larger institutional network. So, they are difficult to create, but once they come into existence, they become very powerful. You see, they become very influential in terms of their consequence once established. You're talking about the East African Community Treaties, the European Union treaties. I'm talking here about the Bologna Treaty. Bologna Treaty, very much the one that governs standardization of higher education in the European Union. You're talking about the World Bank, talking about the IMF, you're talking about the UN bodies, etc. So you see, look at the struggles we are going through to realize, to actualize the East African community protocols. Look at that struggle. But if we manage to reach that level whereby it is now formalized with all those things we think about, those protocols we think about, they become extremely influential. They exert their pressure really on the states. But interestingly, friends, think about the East African Community Treaties, and you ask yourself, why is it that even when you talk about the East African Community Treaties, you still find, you forgive my language here for lack of better words, you still find people who are foreigners to the East African community, being called advisors to those protocols? Why is it you find you'll still have advisors from the World Bank advising the East African community? Because, of course, those ones will be seeing a market here. So you can see how international regimes are intertwined. Even when you talk about the East African community protocols, we'll still have the hegemony coming in to exert its influence. So you can see here we're talking about the functional regimes. You can see those regimes based on pragmatic, very functional as it were. Florence, just a moment. Second, we're talking about regimes that are based on the assignment of property rights, or if you like, the mode of allocation determined by their principles. Now, to explain this kind of regimes serve to promote internationalization. They promote really three things. One, to serve to promote internationalization. Second, they serve to promote nationalization. And the third, they serve to promote free access and exchange. You see, for example, the first one, serving to promote internationalization. Think about regimes that define territorial, sea or oceanic waters, internationalization. Regimes that say, for example, in the Indian Ocean, this is how far Kenya gets into the Indian Ocean. Beyond that, those are international territorial waters. They are now not Kenyan waters. Think about a regime that talks about such like elements, internationalization. We are talking also about this regime serving to ensure the nationalization of resources. Think about, exclusive economic zones. Think about the argument that such and such a country is free, or rather has the absolute right to sell such and such commodity within this area, and not the other one. Think about those regimes that foster free access and exchange of goods, e.g. international waters. Now, you see what we mean by international waters, to differentiate it from the first one. You're talking about territorial waters. These are the waters of Kenya in the Indian Ocean. And when we talk about the last one, we are now talking about even those waters beyond the territorial boundaries of Kenya. We'll talk about those waters, international waters. But you see, there must be some regimes that govern those kind of waters. Now, not every state will just be free to do what it wants within those. Now, I saw that hand up. Maybe we get a comment, then we move. Did I see Florence's hand?
Yes, Mwalimu. My
Yes.
question was actually around bodies like, or rather regimes like the AU, like ECOWAS, that govern within Africa, and where do we place them? How, and also others like the Africa Commission on People and Human Rights, which is born out of the AU. Where do we place them? Because
come again, Florence. Come again, Florence. I lost you. Come again.
Sorry, I'm
Come
saying.
again. Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Oh, no, I was wondering, where do we position bodies like ECOWAS, which governs West Africa, the AU in general, and bodies that have morphed out of the AU, like the African Commission on People and Human Rights, and also going further, that ECOWAS goes beyond the economics and looks at other treaties that the West African states have signed. For example, when the Sierra Leone government went against an AU treaty that they had signed, ECOWAS came strongly against them, and the court ruled against Sierra Leone, and it was binding. So where do we place such bodies?
Correct, Florence. Yeah, Florence is asking us to look at these issues of bodies like the AU plus is attending organizations, bodies like ECOWAS, you know. There is, I think, another one in the south. I don't know what his name is. There is, yes? SADC, yes. Yeah. So and you know, you correctly put it, Florence, that these things now you see they are gaining legal mechanism. Like here in East Africa, we're talking about now. Do we talk about the East African Court of something, whatever it is, where people can go to whatever it is? So yes. Florence is challenging us that where do we place this? Othello, would you like to say something about this?
Thank you, Dr. I'm sorry I've come late because of internet issues. After coming from Athi River, I've been struggling to connect to the class. Now I got some internet somewhere and now I've just joined. Okay, what Florence is saying, but I want to just make a comment first on the internationalization of those regimes that we are talking about. I think also maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. When you talk about international waters, they will be under organizations like IMO, International Maritime Organization, and they have been given power by the states, which maybe are part of the United Nations, different United Nations organizations. Like up there, we are talking about World Bank, IMF, and then UN bodies and things like that. Then for ECOWAS, these are regional organizations, but those regional organizations they operate within the protocols which they are signed internationally. Which those protocols they are normally guided by the United Nations. For example, International Maritime Organization, talking about international waters. Those organizations that govern those waters. For example, airspace, we have IATA, which is also in charge of aviation and internationally. So they have international airspace. If you get into international airspace, you are under the authority of those organizations that control the international airspace, just like we're talking about the sea, the maritime organization. So the Kenyan territorial water, there is that boundary which they have set. So when we have organizations regionally, those regional organizations, they operate like, let me just give an example. For example, states in the United States, they have their state law. As federal state, part of the federal government of the United States, they have their laws individually. But those laws have to operate within the bigger umbrella body as the federal government of the United States. They cannot violate the United States law, which is the United States the Constitution. So their law must operate within the constitutional bounds that are given. So for example, the East African Community is a regional body, but they will all act in accordance with protocols which they have signed with the AU, which is the whole umbrella body for the region, the whole African region. So your law must operate within that organization, should not be outside, such that it will violate the protocols within those organizations. That's how I see it at Malemu.
Correct, I hear that. Sanya, you'd like to add your voice on this?
Not really, Daktari.
Yes.
A simple question.
Yes.
As in, where do you place the colonial masters in this game of regimes? Is there a framework that actually makes them to be part and parcel of the formulation of a particular regime? Talk of East African community, for example. When you talk of its establishment, it is founding. Is there a place whereby the colonial masters must actually play? Is there a role that colonial masters must play as far as the constitution and the establishment of such a body is concerned? That is my question.
Yeah, I think, Sanya, straight away, I think you'd be talking about bodies like the Commonwealth. And, you know, when you talk about Commonwealth, for example, you see Commonwealth wants to come up as an international regime. But you see, even when you talk about Commonwealth as an international regime, then you'll be able to quickly identify a hegemony. You see, and then the colonial master will become the hegemony, trying to whip. This has been also been reflected in West Africa. You see the situation in these two, three countries. Again, what are they? They always escape the mind when you think about them.
That is Burkina Faso. That is
exactly.
Niger, that is
yes.
Mali.
Good.
Yeah.
The situation in those three countries is enough to tell you, you know, like I got surprised, you know, some of these things when you read about them and you hear that, you know, a colonial master has signed a treaty that money will be made in our home. You know, we'll always keep your money in our bank. We'll only give you this percentage of this. This is, again, the kind of issues you are trying to see in the Gaza Strip, you know, the war really in Palestine and so forth. So you see, we're trying to say, we're trying to agree with you, Sanya, that the colonial master will come in, and I feel, is my considered opinion, that the colonial master will struggle to come in as a hegemony. And based on that concept of hegemony, a state with a domineering power, then you can now understand why the situation in those three West African countries is actually a struggle to overcome that kind of thing. Brenda Akinyi, would like to tell us something. Brenda?
Yeah, good evening.
Good evening, Brenda.
Yeah, so just to maybe highlight on a few things, because I've listened keenly. And I mean, I tend to think these colonialists or colonial powers exercise both realism, liberalism, and hegemony, because at the same time, when they bring, when non-governmental bodies like the UN come on board to offer help in, for example, states or rather countries that are considered marginalized in terms of, for instance, when there are wars and all that, you realize that the same UN, for instance, the headquarters is in one of the colonial power states. And at the same time, these West African countries that are fighting, it's, you know, rumor has it that these same colonial powers have a hand in it. So you fail to understand, why are they practicing both? At some point they are liberalists, at some point they also have self-interest in these particular nations. At the same time also they want to dominate. It's a power struggle between the superpowers, or the countries that are known to be the superpowers. Could it be some cyclic concept game, or my understanding actually is taking me towards that area of reasoning?
Yeah, so that we make progress, my thinking is the basic idea behind this international regime is the hegemonic theory. That's my thinking, is the hegemonic theory. So much so that liberalism, especially in the relationship between the developed world and the developing world, liberalism will be brought in as a bait. That look here, we are discussing, we are equals, we want to promote peace, we want to promote stability. You know, even LGBTQ will be quoted as a way that we are promoting peace, we are promoting stability. But you see, behind it, I see the hegemonic hand in it as taking the central stage. And you see, when you talk about realism, then realism already will favor the hegemony because it is a struggle of the balance of power. And you see, we've already seen the hegemony will have the absolute, if you like, the dominant power. So in my view, you know, liberalism as a theory of international regimes is used especially between relationship between the developed and the developing world as a bait. Once that bait is put across, then the end game should be to move towards really a hegemonic kind of approach. Let's make progress. I'm struggling to see if we can ensure that by 8:30 or before 8:30 we are done. Now, before I get back really to take other reflections, would like now to move on to discuss the process of regime formation. The process of regime formation. So, more or less, up to where we are, we can claim we have understood the concept of regime, you know, how regimes operate, the theories that inform regime construction. Now we look at actually regime formation process. And here we'll try to move very fast in the sense that, you know, I compared this in the beginning. What we talk about regime formation can be attributed to what we talked about much earlier in the name of public policy formation. If you understood what we talk about, the processes of public policy formulation, then this is a sister discussion when we're talking about the processes of regime formation. It's more or less similar strategies involved. Now, regime formation implies two things. One, either you are reforming an existing institutional arrangement, an existing regime, or you are creating totally a new regime where none has previously existed. Therefore, when we talk about regime formation, there are those two concepts that should come to our mind. Either we are reforming a regime or we are creating a new regime where none existed before. Now, regime formation generally involves three distinct, though very closely related issues. That when you talk about how regimes are formed, the process of regime formation, there are three questions we'd like to ask ourselves when we're talking about this. The first question in that chronological order, we ask ourselves whether those parties interested in a given issue succeed in forming a regime, or rather they fail to reach a mutual agreement, an agreeable institutional arrangement. So here, you see, in this first question, when talking about regime formation, you know, bodies are coming together, parties are coming together. For example, the East African countries are coming together. You've seen in time and space, we've had other countries that did not belong to this community coming in and expressing interest to join. So the first question in regime formation is whether these parties coming together, you know, based on a given issue, whether they will succeed in forming a regime or whether they will fail to reach a mutual agreement in that arrangement of forming a regime. Now, in case they succeed to reach a mutual agreeable consensus, a mutual agreeable, agreement about, to form a given regime, then the second question applies. So remember the first question: do they succeed to reach a consensus, or do they fail to reach a consensus? So if they fail, the process ends there. Now, in case they succeed to agree, yes, let's come together, let's have this regime on this issue, be it on trade, be it on sharing the resource of this water and so forth. Then the second question comes in. The second question involves a consideration, or rather a transition from the time when really that issue appears really on the active international agenda to when that issue is concluded and becomes an agreement setting forth the terms of the regime. So the second question here is, we now consider what happens between that time, the time between the first question and the time we reach whereby we are coming up really with a regime. So sometimes this period could take years, could take months, could take years, some even could take decades. So that's the second stage, second question to consider in regime formation. The third question now to consider in regime formation is the substantive content. What is going to be the content or the character of that regime which is formed? For example, we are asking, to what extent does the linguistic provisions of a regime address the specific nature of the problems that these regimes are created to address? So you see, these three questions, just to wrap them once more again, so because they are so interrelated. Number one, you see, we are coming together to consider coming together with a regime on a given issue. The issue could be environmental sustainability, the issue could be trade tariffs, the issue could be whatever the issue could be. The issue could be that, like what ECOWAS has been engaged in a few months ago, that there is this war, whatever, the junta in Burkina Faso, the junta in whichever country, and you see ECOWAS is coming together and is arguing, we want to send their troops. So let's consider the first question, whether those parties interested in a given issue, those countries interested in this issue of resolving the crisis in that country, whether they succeed in forming a regime, an agreement that we send there soldiers or not, or we send soldiers to overturn the junta or not. So if they don't succeed, the regime formation process collapses there. If they succeed to convince member states that we need to do this, then they move to number two. Then the question would be to consider what happened now. This number two is about the bargaining period. The bargaining period. It involves the time from the appearance of an issue on the active international agenda to the conclusion of an agreement setting forth the terms of that regime. So it would be now, if we agree we are going to send, these soldiers in that country, what are the nitty-gritties now? What will they go there to do? What about ABCD? What will they be involved in that country, if it is the case, and so forth? And then, once you have agreed, then, the putting down of the regime, sometimes we say on paper now, we are now concerned, the linguistic provisions. Do they mirror, do they address the specific problems that the regime was set out to fulfill? You see, in policy formulation, this is the kind of thing we asked, that when you are now writing that policy, the writing of the policy, the wording of the policy, does it address the intentions and the goals of the authority that moved out to create the policy? So the third question, the substantive content, the character of the regimes created, do they address linguistically, when you look at the linguistic provisions, do they address that which was intended to be addressed? You know, that is what we are talking about when we are addressing the issue of really those regime formation processes. Now, when addressing the concept of regime formation, 6 issues come to the fore. One, you address the issue about the behavior of the actors, really. When you are now talking about regime formation, the issues to look at, really, when you are looking at or analyzing, really, regime formation elements. 6 issues to be considered. One, you consider the behavior of the actors in regime formation. Who are the actors? So these actors, will be talking about them. You'll be talking about state nations, you'll be talking about NGOs, you'll be talking about individuals. So you address the behavior of the actors. Second, you address the processes of regime formation. You know, how are regimes formed? What we've just, given a prelude to. Thirdly, you address the element of the stages of regime formation. Remember, we are addressing the element of how do you analytically evaluate regime formation. So number 1, the behavior of the actors, the process of regime formation. Number 3, stages of regime formation. Number 4, you ask yourself, what about the driving social forces? What is the driving social force behind this regime formation? You notice elements of public policy formation, you can hear the bells of public policy formation being rung. Number 5, you talk about cross-cutting factors, cross-cutting factors. In policy formulation, remember we talked about those, what you'd call factors that may not be within that country, may not be elected, whatever, but they still exhibit a lot of influence in policy formation. The same thing again applies when you are considering regime formation. And then finally is to look at the multiplicity of the issues involved. How does that regime address the developing, extraneous variables, if you like, the multiplicity of the issues to be involved in that. So these are the elements you'd want to look at when you are talking about regime formation. Next, we look now at these actors, the actors and actor behavior. The question here we are asking, who frames, who influences the issues for inclusion in the international regime agenda? Who influences? And here we're sharing that quite a number of actors may come to play. This may include states and even non-state actors. They may even include individuals. I will now not really go a lot about this because we've explained some of these things in previous slides. Just to mention, when you talk about non-state actors and even individuals, think about when you go to these international fora, UNO meetings, these climate change gatherings, you have these groups that you'll call non-state delegation. You'll have these people, you'll talk scientific experts or advisors and so forth. These people come, they write papers, they give ideas, and what they say exerts a lot of influence in the ultimate regime that is produced. That, please mute. And then we're talking about, as we look at these people, remember that regimes remain properly understood as social practices created to guide interactions among the members of the international society, that is the state. So please mute. May that person mute kindly.
Please mute.
Yeah. May that person mute. Yeah. So you see, that kind of understanding that there are several actors and you can see them. You see, this last bullet that talks about regimes remaining properly understood as social practices may help the argument we had initially, whether we can include in this discussion the Al-Qaeda bodies, the whatever Al-Shabaab and so forth, may help us be able to address some of those issues. So those are really the actors involved. Now, regarding the process of regime formation, three features come to the fore. Three features come to the fore as really controlling this process. That is, we can either talk about the self-generated or what we call spontaneous regimes. We can also talk about the negotiated regimes. And we can now talk about regimes by imposition. So when you're talking about how regimes are formed, and you are specifically considering the process of regime formation, the process of regime formation. How is this process? This process of regime formation manifests itself in three possible ways. Either a regime is imposed, regime is imposed. Here we are talking about very much the hegemony, or the regime is a negotiated regime. A negotiated regime, you can see that is the liberal currents, or the regime is self-generated, meaning we are talking about the realist tenets, whereby a situation is made that makes nation or actors realize that we are in a state of nature, and if nothing happens, we are all going to die. We might die. So self-generated or spontaneous regime is about the converging expectations that do not require conscious efforts of the actors. Ellickson 1991 says that regimes develop as a means of producing order without law. Regimes really develop as a means of producing order without law. There is no law guiding this, so a regime comes in to produce order. And that's why we say this first categorization of the processes that we are calling self-generated or spontaneous regimes, can best be explained in the context of the realist theory of international regimes. The negotiated regime process is defined as really a deliberate, conscious process of bargaining. So parties here come together, engage in extended effort to reach out mutual agreements. So you can see this is the area of the liberal tenet, the liberal currents within regime formation. So again, here you can see this is very much what we can call the liberal theories of international regime formation. And then imposition, here you can see a single powerful actor, or in some cases we are saying a small coalition of powerful actors. This could be World Bank, a small coalition of very powerful actors. This could be the European Union. This could be a single power actor, America, whatever it is, comes up, induces others to accede to his preferences. So the prime movers here operate on the basis of structured powers. This is what we have said before. They'll operate on the basis of very structured powers. They will influence presidents of nations. They will influence the legislature. They'll influence the ruling elites within those countries, leading to the actors to supply institutional arrangements and so the formation of regimes. So you can see those threefold process avenues that actually correspond to what we can call those theoretical frameworks in international regime formulation. Now, we talk about the stages of regime formation. Again here, very much the structure of public policy formation. They may not be those 5 or 6, whatever it is, I mean, rather 5, as we saw them in a public policy formation. But the philosophy, the understanding is more or less the same. Stages of regime formation, 3 stages. Begins from agenda formation, then institutional choice, then operationalization. So when you talk about the first stage, that is the agenda formation, we're talking about how an issue emerges. Here, there is the emergence of the issue. An issue emerges on the political agenda, on the economic agenda, on the environmental agenda, whatever agenda it is, an issue emerges. Then it is framed for consideration in the international forum. So you see, you'll have experts coming to deliver speech on this. You'll have the UN bodies, experts coming to talk about this. Finally, that issue rises high enough and warrants to gain priority treatment at these international forums. So you see, that is the first stage, the agenda formation. You can see very much like public policy formulation. Second, we talk about the second stage of regime formation, which we call the institutional choice. Now, this is now a movement from priority, after really the first stage where an issue gains priority, from priority level to the point of agreement on the provisions of the specific regime. So this one corresponds to that second level in the previous slide. So you see here, an issue emerges, reaches priority level. People are convinced it needs to be addressed. And then it moves on. It moves on from that priority level to the point at which we have the agreement on how the provisions of that specific regime will look like. So here is again when we are talking about the linguistic structure of that regime. And then we move to the final stage, really, of international regime formation, where we talk about the operationalization stage. This stage is about all activities that will transform that agreement in the institutional choice level on paper into a functioning social practice. So in the operational stage, this is where you'll find even the elements of domestication of those international instruments. So efforts in this stage are on the part of the member states to bring a regime's rules to bear on various non-state actors and even the state actors. Here we are talking about the practical domestication and implementation process. So here we're talking about a regime that has been formed at the international level. And then we'll be talking about its domestication. So now there is the issue of take it to parliament, pass it, domesticate it, let it be ratified, the president signs whatever it is. There are instruments put across, legal instruments. Whoever violates that kind of regime, what will happen? That's what we're talking about, the non-state actors. So that I'm imagining this, just to explain this. If you assume you are talking about environmental pollution and you are talking about these plastic bags, then you should be able to see how this element is being cascaded down until when its implementation will reach the non-state actors and again a practical domestication and implementation process, whereby now we'll be struggling in the country to make sure that we bring into control, these plastic bags in the environment. Always remember that state power in all these processes, in this international community, plays a central role in these stages. So this really state power will reveal its influence, whether you are moving in this direction as realist, moving in this direction as liberalist, or moving in this direction as really what we are calling the hegemony. Now, having said that, then we now look at this slide that helps us to understand really the critical driving forces behind regime formation. What are the critical forces? You know, behind people, behind individual, behind nations. What are the critical forces? Three critical forces really play a very critical causal role in the process of regime formation. That is power, knowledge, and interest. So when you talk about that country, that nation, that individual, is an issue of power, knowledge, and interest. This power can be explained in various ways. This power could be political power, could be economic power, could be military power, and so forth. So talking about power, we are saying regimes will always reveal who is paying the piper, because who is paying the piper will call the tune. Therefore, international regimes will always reveal something about the distribution of power in the material sense. Therefore, we're saying here, regimes will normally change when this structure of power changes or shifts internationally. So today, if Americans, for example, really carry this power, whether this power is to be understood militarily, economically, politically, whatever, if that power was to change hands, then, regimes will automatically change in that direction. Knowledge is yet another critical factor which really exerts a lot of social influence in regime formation. Knowledge here is seen as one form of power, so it can be referred in the first category. It's seen also as a power. Is power distinct really from the structure of power? Whoever has the knowledge, whoever invests in knowledge, in technology, will control the world. Whoever invests in knowledge creation, we're talking about, the world becoming really knowledge-based economy, whatever it is. Whoever invests in in knowledge, will actually control the world. Therefore, knowledge is yet another powerful critical factor that is behind regime formation. Finally, we talk about interest. But you see, this interest coming third, I have a feeling that will actually, to a large extent, depend on the first two. You cannot talk about national interest if you have no power, if you have no knowledge to protect that national interest. However, interests are normally expressions of hegemony in the search for solutions to collective action problems. So you see, interest here can only gain traction if really you are talking about the hegemony's interest. Otherwise, interest in the context of liberalism, interest in the context of realism will actually really crumble when power and knowledge comes to play or comes to the fore. So those three provide us with an understanding of the basic forces behind really regime formation. Very close towards the end, we look at what we call the cross-cutting factors that influence regime formation. And these cross-cutting factors really, I kind of present two. The first one is what we call individual leadership and the context. We're trying to say here, dear friends, that behind power, behind knowledge, and behind national state interests, you see, much of what will go into the formation of a regime will very much depend on the context in which that regime is being formulated, and also on the individual leadership. Occasionally, it is very clear that, most of the times you find individual leaders have come up in space and time powerful enough to move given world agenda to the next level. So really, authors like Young and Osherenko here, 1993, has given us three types of leaders that you like perhaps to look at your own time, what we call the structural leaders, the intellectual leaders, and what we call really the entrepreneurial leaders. Each of these leadership styles or types of leaders have certain things unique to themselves. And I'm just trying to look at my note, just bear with me. I'm looking at my note to be able to add some flesh on this. And anyway, structural leaders, we're talking about structural leaders, we're talking about intellectual leaders, and talking about entrepreneurial leaders. These types of leaders, have different currents, different, advantages or different strength and weakness. For example, the structural leaders are those individuals who will normally present states and devise really approaches that bring about power in the material or structural sense. These are people who are leaders who are able to push the states, that are able to represent states and come up with arrangements that can actually bring power in the material and structural sense to bear on the process of regime formation. When you talk about intellectual leaders, these ones, unlike the structural leaders, very much the ones who are able to develop, those who are able to exploit ideas that can shape the way issues are framed. So you're talking about having a leader in a nation, having a president in a nation, not just by paper certification, but people who are intellectual leaders who can be able to think about. Now, I'm going to make allusions just for the sake of explanation. I could be wrong, but just for the sake of explanation. We're talking about that elect Mwai Kibaki, the late Mwai Kibaki, who finds the nation economically at that given position, does not complain to anybody, does not address the citizens on how the economy is bad, but goes down to think as an intellectual leader and develops and exploits ideas, ending up shaping these ideas in a way that he frames them and energizes them to bring up really a kind of a regime formation that finally changes the society. You see, intellectual leaders. Do I want to say these are intellectually gifted leaders? Intellectually gifted leaders, I don't want to say is simply by virtue of, academic leaders. Not just academic leaders, but really intellectually gifted leaders. Then we're talking about entrepreneurial leaders or leadership. These are leaders who would endeavor to highlight the integrative aspects of institutional bargaining. These are people who can bargain. These are people who can move out there and bargain. I'm not very sure, perhaps I'm being pushed, my mind is being pushed too far. But are we trying to say that this intellectual leadership and this entrepreneurial leadership could be what gained ground in Mwai Kibaki's leadership? I'm just imagining. I could be wrong, but I'm just imagining. So that we get in him the power of the intellect economically to move the country that level, and we get in him the entrepreneurial skills that is able to move around, able to bring more people into the tax bracket, more people are able to pay taxes, able to change the direction of economics from the west to the east, whatever it is. Is that what we're talking about? Whether that is what we are talking about or not, we are saying the direction that really an international regime formation process takes gains more from individual leadership styles of the one leading really a delegation or leading a state, a nation state, and so forth. This is why I'm posing the question that why do you think perhaps intellectual leadership would be particularly prominent at the agenda formation stage, while entrepreneurial leadership could be more important at the stage of institutional choice? Taslin, you have something to say.
Thank you so much. To answer, or just to try and answer your question, intellectual leaders are very important at this stage because they are key in goal setting. They are result oriented, and also they know what they are doing. Like maybe if you are doing something on maybe peace building, then they know what peace building is and everything that's around it. So it's very important to put them here so that they can put everything that's important at this stage. But then now, after they are done with this stage, then we bring the entrepreneurial leaders who are now negotiators, who can now fight for, like, they can make sure that whatever is being discussed on the table, we are also getting a chunk of it. We are also benefiting, so that we don't sign something that is not going to be beneficial to us. Thank you.
Very well, Taslin. Anybody would like to add a voice on this? Maybe just finishing. Yes, I can see the hand of who here. Yes. Whose hand is up? Yes, I can see the hand of Amata, Paul Amata.
Yes,
Paul? Yes, Paul.
Maybe just concur with my colleague there, and that the intellectuals have the expertise and speciality in a certain field, that's skills. And then the entrepreneurial ones will come in with the funding aspect. Thank you.
Very well. Nalondo, your hand is up. Would you like to add weight on this?
Yes, this is Wekesa. Now,
Yes.
intellectuals are needed at this formation stage because they have the abilities, the capabilities, the skills that help them to articulate ideas which forms shape of the, or rather the priorities that will be able to drive the agendas in the setting of the particular agenda that will be needed in the formation of the group.
Very well. Now, maybe let's
and therefore
move.
they're critical because they form.
Did we lose you? Yeah, I think we are losing you. We are losing you, Wekesa.
Okay, I was simply saying intellectuals have the ideas, they have the skills, and they have the requisite ideas that forms part and parcel of the agendas. They form the shape of the agendas that needs to be taken while forming the I don't know, my network is breaking or I'm
It's fine, Wekesa. So I think you understand. That is a question that we need to really, I can see more hands here. Did I see
can I say something?
Who is this?
Yeah, my name is
Nyabere.
Sam Nyabere, yes.
Good, Sam.
I'm looking at this statement and I'm self-doubting. I'm not sure whether I'm going to be very simplistic.
Sam, I seem to be losing you.
Sorry, are you getting me now? Can the class hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Maybe
yes.
It's Doc. Dr. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Very well. I was saying that I'm sorry if I will sound simplistic, but I'm trying to think that an intellectual leader is one who has strength at the idea level, idea conceptualization, and knowledge level. Whereas an entrepreneurial leader is one with probably strong business acumen, which we can say maybe entrepreneurial skills that will be requisite for institutional choice, whereas this one that is intellectual would actually be of benefit at the conceptual stage, where people need knowledge and ideas to especially formulate policy that an entrepreneur can now act on to actually produce desired results. I do not know whether it makes sense, actually.
Sorry, you make a lot of sense indeed. You make a lot of sense. Now, let's finish up this slide, and then I'm going to invite other comments about this. So, I think you appreciate the critical role that individual leadership, besides state power, besides knowledge that that state has, besides the interest that that state has, you know, the humble joke here is, you see, this individual leadership could also carry what we call, with a tongue in cheek, individual interests also. So you can see what individual leadership can do, what individual leadership can do to really regime formation. Now, the second really issue that is really cross-cutting outside there is the context. We said the context. So when we're talking about the context, we are saying that international regime formation occurs within a context. They don't occur in a vacuum. So other issues can actually intrude, may be able to promote or impede formation, this regime formation process. So we must also consider the context in which a regime is being formulated. You see, you know, when we're talking about the context, we're trying to say perhaps, you know, why did East African community collapse at that time? Do we say we don't engage again because it collapsed? Then we say, no, we are in a different context, different national interests, different concerns, different awareness, and so forth. So the context itself can render itself as a factor that will bring about really a quickening of this regime formation, or also impeding this regime formation. Finally, we want to address ourselves really on this final slide on the issue that I call the multivariate model. Here the question is, the fundamental question that we are asking is, what are the multiple tracks along which varied regime formation processes can move towards the same equivalent ends? So that we are trying to say, when a given regime formation process has begun, there could be several issues that are coming together. For example, if we are talking about environmental sustainability, you know, several issues would come together. Afforestation would come in. You know, money will be brought in to plant trees, to have a national holiday to plant trees. We're talking about, you know, global warming issues would come in. So several things, these several things are what we are calling really the multiple tracks that will come in and work to push a regime towards the high ground of being formulated and being implemented. That's why we talk about processes that will coalesce, will converge towards same equivalent ends. Same equivalent ends. So here, you see, even the leadership style we have, even, you know, perhaps it could be the party in office, you know, a given political leadership would come in the country, and you find that the former leadership was deflected towards the east. Now a new leadership comes and deflects towards the west, and therefore you find now international regimes that are Western clinging, they will tend to gain traction in the available regime as opposed to the former regime. So here we say regime formation processes is now understood as a bargain. People are simply bargaining. States are bargaining. It's a bargaining process among the actors. A striking is an issue of a striking deal among the actors that are now pushing, pushing the negotiation, pushing the interest towards a certain realization. So this should help us understand fundamentally how regimes are formed. I think I will invite maybe a maximum of 2-3 comments, because this is more or less our last slide before we can now look at the assignment that we'll take home from this. Nyabere, please. Nyabere? Nyabere is not with us. Othello?
No, I'm here, sir. I was
Nyabere?
struggling to unmute myself.
Fine.
Yeah, so I wanted to say, I don't know whether the statement I'm going to make will be controversial. I'm just still thinking about this idea of the different kinds of leaders. And I would like to call our current president an intellectual leader, whereas, what do you call it? Mwai Kibaki was an entrepreneurial leader, I mean. Is that a political statement, or can I be understood to be using that as an analogy to show my understanding of the different kinds of leadership?
Nyabere, we will not say yes or no until you explain. We want you to explain.
That is debatable. You can explain now.
Yeah. My own perception of the current president is that he is really so full of rhetorics, and because he exudes intelligence, but on the ground, people are not very happy. People cannot feel growth. Whereas Mwai Kibaki was a gentleman who didn't talk much, but there was a difference on the ground. There was money flowing. People were not as broke as they are today.
All right. Nyabere, we leave that for what we call internal forum discussion, whereby you'll be able to build issues really around that. Let's listen to Osanya. Let's listen to Osanya.
Thank you, Dr.
Yes, Osanya.
I wish not to go into the discussion of our president, but to me, it's more structural than intelligent. On the issue of intellectual leaders, I would suggest, or rather, I'll say, I wanted to say at the stage of formation, we need them because they are more think tanks. And very crucial at that stage.
All right. Thank you. Good. Now, we want to finish this discussion this way. I think I will send you this. I'll ask just to this my last slide of assignment, and here I'm saying, for your assignment for this topic 6 on international regime theory, I'm asking you kindly to find time to listen to these 3 short learning videos and respond to the reflective question below it. The first video there is 8 minutes. The second one there is 14 minutes. The last one is 26 minutes. So it might take you about really an hour to do all the whatever, approximately, but not ahead of that. And the question I would like you to think about is, reflecting on contemporary economic, political, or any other issue of your choice in Kenya or in any other country of your choice, where you feel you are most conversant. Reflecting on contemporary, it could be economic, political, it could be educational, or any other issue of your choice in Kenya, or if you like, in any other country of your choice that you feel you are more informed. Based on these 3 videos, would you critically evaluate the practical strength and weakness of realism, liberalism, and hegemonic theories of international regimes really be able to critically evaluate the practical strength, the practical weakness of realism, liberalism, and hegemonic theories of international regimes. As a learning point in this assignment, always remember to illustrate your arguments. I thank you, friends. We meet next time.
Daktari, before you go,
please.
Daktari,
Yes.
please tell us the marks for this assignment and the number of pages for this assignment. Thank you.
Good. I would not want to give paginations because people can use fewer words. People can use fewer words, but communicate quite a bit of content. Others would write pages, but would say the same idea in the same words.
Yeah.
I would really just summon you to critically evaluate, for example, pick up an issue. It could be an economic issue. And you notice in our discussion, we brought up a lot of this. In other words, the videos I'm sending you, they are a summary of what international regimes are and how international regime theories inform international regimes. Thank you.
Max,
One more,
Max, Daktari?
I think let me remain reserved on that because yes, please.
Is it a group work or an individual?
I would wish this one comes as individual.
One more question.
Okay. Yes, please.
The timing, its due date is 21st November. The last due date you gave us.
Pardon?
The due data.
Yes.
It's 11:59, 21st November.
Yes.
Or 12 a.m. 1st November.
Did you say something about time?
Yes, because the previous assignment,
yes.
we knew we were handing it in by today, end of business.
Yes.
But I think from what was reflected in the portal,
yes.
when we were submitting, it looked like you're 8 hours late or 6 hours late. So I think time is...
sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Let's go by this, and I'll ask the university they'll be able to put this correctly in the portal. Sorry for that. So we go just by these dates, the close of business.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Can we also get the notes?
Where not? Would you be referring to the slides or reading?
The slides.
All right. I'll ask the university to look into that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Daktari, are the videos already in the link or you will post?
Yeah, I think we'll post this. Let me put this in WhatsApp and ask the university to load these things by tomorrow.
Okay,
but I'll put it in the WhatsApp immediately after this.
Thank you.
Why is it crying? Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Good night. Good night, people.
Good night. Yeah, give him go to the other water. Just give him go to
Thank
the
you,
other
Daktari.
one.
Thank you.
Good night.
Mama, any what on your carpet?